Hey guys, I'm Jax and this is my spoiler-free review for the new horror film, The Exorcist Believer. The newest film in a long line of legacy sequel films that pick up 20 to 40 years later after the original iconic film that is mostly just a reboot, but also enough of a sequel where there's an old legacy character from the film you love who rocks up and is like, I'm here, and I'm old, and I've been through this before, and it sucked then, and it sucks now. The contents of the film for the characters, to be clear. I'm not saying, don't get me wrong, I am not saying the original Exorcist sucks. This film, on the other hand, somehow actually not as bad as you'd think. But I may be wrong, because I've seen some thumbnails, and apparently I liked this more than most, and I would not say that I liked this. So this film is a direct sequel to the original Exorcist film, whilst pretty much ignoring all of the, not so successful sequels of the franchise. And you might be thinking, that actually sounds a lot like 2018's Halloween. Yes, it's pretty much exactly the same idea. This film is also directed by that same director, David Gordon Green. David Gordon Green is back to direct another iconic horror franchise sequel set 20 to 40 years later, ignoring all the bad films that you don't really remember that you vaguely saw. Coward move once again to ignore all the terrible films in the franchise and only go back to the original one that we all find a classic and love. Coward move! What's not a coward move is the studio executives giving David Gordon Green the keys to the Exorcist castle after his performance with 2 of the 3 Halloween films. Because 2018 Halloween film, pretty great. Everybody kind of universally was like, hey, that could be worse, but it could be better, but it could have been a lot worse. That was actually pretty damn good. A great legacy sequel / reboot to the franchise. But then he did direct Halloween Evil Dies Tonight Kills. Infamously bad. I kind of love it, but I think I love it because it's so terrible. Evil Dies Tonight. Just, what an insane movie. And then, of course, Halloween Ends, which is such an interesting, creative idea, and the execution of it is so poor and bad, and that third act is atrocious. So it's just crazy. They're like, yeah, 1 out of 3. That's good enough to take another iconic horror franchise. Have the keys. Do whatever you want. Maybe do that entire franchise in one movie where you starts off, you're like, this is actually pretty fantastic. I'm surprised. And then in the middle, you're like, you've lost me a little bit. And then by the end, you're like, maybe you're winning me back. And then by the end of the end, you're like, you've lost me so hard. I'm retroactively looking back on all of it and going, was any of it any good whatsoever? What is this guy doing? He's a madman. This guy just wants to get his grubby little fingers in every iconic horror franchise and just make not good films. They're thought-provoking and interesting in a film discussion way, because I'm like, what is this? This is insane. This is so crazy. This is so bad, but it's so good at one point. I am so mixed on this film, and I'm so happy that whoever owns these horror franchises doesn't pull a Disney every time someone makes a bad film. They're like, oh, sorry, you made that one bad film that's not Star Wars related. That Star Wars film we gave you, zoink! Not yours anymore. And they close the door, and then they throw them down the stairs, and they kick them on the ground, and they go, no Star Wars movie for you, says the Disney executives or whatever. Unlike Disney, whoever's owning these horror franchises is just like, yeah, I don't care if you make 100 bad films. Just make another iconic horror franchise legacy sequel set 20 to 40 years later, where, the character from the film we all love rocks up and goes, I'm here, but I'm old now. And then have other stuff happen. We're going to make money. Everyone's going to go see this opening day regardless because of the Exorcist IP. Which I did. Despite the trailer not impressing me whatsoever. God, they've got me. I'm part of the problem. I realize that now. But you know who's more part of the problem? The director of this movie, David Gordon Green. I just don't understand how he got this film. It's crazy to me. It's crazy to me. I love it. I love that he made this film. I don't love the film. All right, let's get to the film. The film itself is actually not as bad as you'd think. I didn't hate the film at all. I thought the first hour was easily the best part of the film. The tone and the atmosphere is really kind of, It's restrained and it's slow paced. The film is really patient in its pacing, which I really appreciate. The first Exorcist film takes its time getting up to the Exorcist and the exorcism and the possession of the little girl. And this time, because it's a sequel, there's not one little girl possessed. You guessed it. There's two. And you might be thinking, wow, two. So two families, two parents, two different groups of parents dealing with this. Technically, yes. But also not really. No, there's one family who are there and are on screen sometimes, and they do say words. So technically there are two families. But we mostly focus on one family, which is a single father, and his arc is really interesting, and his kind of like story as it progresses is the only thing in the third act, like the way it kind of comes to fruition, that works for me. There's some really horrible, bold, and interesting choices that I think almost work. But for me, this film is really, really great up until the possession goes full exorcism and we have little children who usually sound like this. I'm a little child. You know how little children sound. But then when they go possessed, they're all like, oh, you swear words. They just have this vibe. Every film that's not the original Exorcist film, any film that tackles exorcisms and has children, we saw this very recently with The Pope's Exorcist, a film that even Russell Crowe himself, one of the greatest actors of all time, couldn't save from being mediocre. This film suffers from the same thing, where once the kids are possessed, the makeup's great, their performances, their movements, and their facial expressions, everything's working so well, and then the voices just make it seem so goofy and silly, and I can't take it seriously, and I can tell it's not the children's voices. I just don't understand why exorcism films to do with possession with children all have to do the same type of voice. And they're always just saying perverse stuff, and they're always being gross and vulgar. And I understand, yeah, it's like a callback or whatever to the original film. I'm so sick of it. It feels so generic. It feels so derivative. It's so boring at this point. And that might just be a personal taste from my own preference of just not liking that type of child possession. I've seen it once, and every other film just doesn't do it as good, and it doesn't do anything new and fresh and interesting and innovative with it. It's just like the same thing. Have the child, and that's so frustrating because the performances are so good. Like the facial expressions and the way they twist and move, it's really good. The kids in this, the two kids, that's right, it's a sequel. There's two of them this time. They are so good. Like, so good. Shockingly good. But their voices, it's such a letdown. The whole third act doesn't work at all. There's a priest character who's maybe the most undeveloped character of all time. And what they do with him is almost something. But because he's so underdeveloped, I couldn't care less about anything that happens to him. The ending feels rushed, and I see what they were trying to do. It's quite a dark, intense ending, and it leaves it on quite an interesting note. But because of the whole third act just not working and falling really flat and feeling really boring and derivative and uninteresting, I'm like, oh, that is a great idea, but I'm out. I'm already done. Like, I've checked out. I'm not involved in the film anymore, which is so funny and odd because for the first half of the movie, I am so invested. That first hour is actually so different and unique with how it follows our main father parent, and just the mood and the atmosphere is slow, it's quiet, it's atmospheric and interesting. And then when they first kind of start showing signs of maybe being possessed, there's some really interesting and unique things where it's not just them in a bedroom shaking on a bed saying vulgar things to a bunch of people and a priest or whatever. There's some really cool, interesting and terrifying little moments, little quiet moments of dread and horror, and like there's such an odd sense of foreboding because you know what's coming. This is an Exorcist film. I know what's about to happen to these children. We all do. We've seen The Exorcist. I know what's coming. And so as it builds up to that moment, there's so many little great moments. And that first hour, I'm like, I am in. Everything to do with our original characters from the original film, I found to be hollow, soulless, uninspired. And there's an emotional payoff to the legacy characters that I think is so shallow and so unearned. It's like a moment where you're meant to be like, oh, like this big moment, and I felt like flat. I felt embarrassed for the directors. I'm like, you didn't earn any of this. I don't understand. Like the whole back half does not work for me at all, and it's so frustrating because there are some really interesting ideas of religion and spirituality and faith, and you guess it, believing. What it doesn't mean to believe. What do people believe in? And the first hour really sets up some interesting like themes and thought-provoking ideas. And then it collapses in on itself. There's a horribly cheesy monologue by a character that I found like cringy. Like I was like, ugh, ugh, don't do that. All I can say is give this man a Friday the 13th. Give this man Nightmare on Elm Street. I hope this man gets his grubby little paws in every horror franchise and just doesn't do a very good job, because I want to see those films. It's not funny the way his Halloween films were. He brought like this interesting oddball comedy, darkly perverse, and there's one moment like 5 minutes in where I'm like, that's really funny. That's kind of a crazy little scene. This is interesting. And there's nothing like that. It's just super self-serious. At a certain point, all the interesting cinematography and filmmaking, it just descends into chaos and insanity. And there are just shots and imagery and just stuff that's just thrown at the screen. And you're like, what is going on, David Gordon Green? You were so restrained and clever and interesting and it was so good. And then it got so bad.